Hello, and welcome to the VSC podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. My name is Shaye, and I'm a victim advocate and crisis counselor at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. In today's episode, I have with me Rachel Stachler, who was born and raised in South Florida and graduated with her master's degree in social work from the University of Central Florida in 2022. After graduation, Rachel worked at VSC as a victim advocate and crisis counselor before moving to Georgia, where she currently works as a case manager for adults with ID and acquired brain injuries in a supportive residential community. In today's episode, we will be discussing adults with intellectual disabilities, commonly referred to as ID and/or IDD. In this podcast, we discuss sensitive topics such as violence and sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. That's 407-500-4325. For the Florida State Sexual Line, it's 888-956-7273. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There is always someone ready to help. Hi, Rachel.
Hey Shay, thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, I'm glad you can make it. Today we're talking about adults with intellectual disabilities, and I know we spoke a little bit beforehand, but I just want to ask the broadest question ever. What are intellectual disabilities?
Absolutely. So intellectual disability refers to kind of a dysfunction or disability that affects learning and skill building. For someone to be diagnosed with intellectual disability, their IQ actually has to fall under 70. They have to show significant limitations in adaptive functioning, essentially skills that are required for us to live, work, and play. And they have to be identified as having these limitations before the age of 22.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that that there was an age. Okay. Well, how many people have intellectual disabilities?
Yep. So, according to the Special Olympics website, an estimated 1 to 3% of the population has intellectual disability. So, in America, that translates to a couple hundred million.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, is there a cause to an intellectual disability?
So, intellectual disability can be caused by a bunch of different things, but some of the most common causes would be an injury to the brain or an injury suffered during pregnancy or birth, complications at birth, such as a lack of oxygen to the brain, disease in early childhood or during pregnancy, and then just challenges or differences with brain development. There are a couple different diagnoses that, listeners might be a little bit more familiar with that are commonly associated with intellectual disability. Genetic disorders like Down syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, birth and pregnancy related disorders such as fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, acquired injuries like a traumatic brain injury, or developmental disabilities like autism spectrum disorder.
Very interesting. Okay. So, next we're kind of getting into like the myths, right? Because these are things that I feel I feel a lot of the population might have about people, specifically maybe adults with intellectual disabilities. One of the big ones is that people with intellectual disabilities they cannot learn or be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to preface this conversation by saying we have come a really long way as a society with how we see people with intellectual disability or developmental disabilities. We've moved away from institutionalization. We've moved away from a lot of harmful language that we used to use for adults with intellectual disability. But there are still some pervasive myths that I think hold the community back. And like you kind of touched on, one of those is that, people with ID, and you'll hear me refer to intellectual disability as ID as I talk, but that people with ID cannot learn or be successful. So I pulled some stats from the Journal of Vocational Rehab, but about 44% of adults with ID, ages 21 to 64, are in the labor force. About 62% of those folks who are employed have spent 3 years or longer at their current job. And in more sheltered or more accessible settings, about 81% of those individuals have worked at their job for at least 3 years. And a lot of adults with intellectual disability do go on to attend and complete college, whether or not that is a specifically structured program.
That being said, kind of piggybacking off of that, I know a lot of people treat adults with ID like children, and they
Mm-hmm.
maybe coddle them or treat them like they're fragile. But I feel like that's not what they are. They're not fragile. They are adults. They are able to make decisions on their own, just like the rest of us. And they're
Mm-hmm.
also able to do quote unquote normal human things. So, do you want to speak a little bit about where that myth maybe came from, or
Sure. So many years ago, believe prior to you and I, mental age theory was pretty popular, and you'll still find people kind of using that vernacular today. But it is essentially giving adults with intellectual disability an age that they quote unquote function at. And what we found is that those numbers are often really inaccurate and also often very limiting for people. Like, for example, you could have a 30-year-old man with intellectual disability, and a doctor or a family member in the past could have labeled that man as someone who functions at the age of, for say, an 8-year-old or a 6 to 8-year-old, where that might be true as far as IQ or certain adaptive functioning skills. That would absolutely not be true for all facets of that person's life. And it definitely takes out of the equation the fact that adults with intellectual disabilities are adults. They have the right to vote, they have the right to make informed decisions about their care. And many adults with intellectual disability are their own guardians, which would give them the exact same rights that you or I would have. And they might need some supports to make the same decisions that you or I would make. They might not. But it is definitely very important that we are cognizant about how adults should be treated like adults, regardless or not if they have differences in learning and in skills.
so there's also a common myth about people with ID needing your help, um, which isn't always true for sure. Do you want to
Mm-hmm.
speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's important just to highlight and remind people that just because someone might need a little bit more time to complete a task, or just because they might complete that task in a different way or in a different order than you would, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need help completing that task or that it would be appropriate for you to take over that task and do it for them. So, a good rule of thumb is if you're interacting with someone with an intellectual disability, the same way you would with any other adult that you're talking to, is if you see someone that appears to potentially be struggling with something, you should always ask before you assume that that person needs your assistance. And you should probably ask in what way they need your assistance, because it is disempowering to take over tasks and do things for other people. There's like a saying, I think it goes something like, if you give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he'll eat for his entire life. And people with ID can't build skills if they don't ever have the opportunity to do things independently.
That's really good. I like that because it builds self-esteem, and confidence when you are
Mm-hmm.
able to complete a task by yourself. And that's with anything or any skill. So,
Absolutely. Yeah. And the supported community that I work at, we have a lot of adults that move in and will think that they are functioning at a certain level. And really, when they get in this community where they have the opportunity to do more things for themselves, we'll find that they're so much more capable than we thought they were when they moved in. They just didn't grow up in a setting where they were allowed to do things for themselves.
That's interesting because you would hope that those people came from families or a community before that maybe knew, but I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and some of these myths and some of these, mistakes that people make with adults with ID, it's not out of a place of harm. But if we over coddle and do things for other people, we don't give them the opportunity to reach their full potential. So it's definitely important to keep that in mind, that we're all adults learning and we all have the opportunity to gain and improve our skills.
It's very good. So I think the last myth that we had here was people with ID cannot have romantic or sexual relationships.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. And I think that makes people uncomfortable sometimes, especially if you have it internalized that, people with ID are more childlike than people without ID. It can be a little bit strange to think about adults with ID as sexual or romantic beings, but they absolutely are and absolutely can be if that's something that they're interested in being. So, throwing it back to where I work, we have so many relationships on our campus. Some of our relationships on campus have lasted several years long. They're really gorgeous, beautiful, fulfilling relationships that are very healthy. Some of our relationships on campus are toxic or short lived or for lack of better terms, just a mess. But the beautiful thing about that is that's how our relationships are as people without ID off campus or in the outside world. So I think it's just really important to kind of like I talked about, not jumping in and helping or saving people with ID from struggle. We also have to let people with ID make mistakes and learn in relationships. The only thing I will say is that, as a service provider to adults with ID, the only thing I'm really looking out for when people seem to be engaging in a romantic or a sexual relationship with one another is I like to do some formal assessing just to make sure that both adults have the ability to consent and that they can understand, how to set boundaries, how to say no to unwanted physical touch, how to leave a relationship that they don't want to be in, and then how to say yes to things that they are okay with. But absolutely, people with ID have relationships. And a lot of people with ID will get married and have children and can have very fulfilling family lives that way as well.
Amazing. Talking about the consent and the assessing you mentioned, at VSC, we provide forensic collections, or as they're commonly known as rape kits. I know
Mm-hmm.
that I've had situations, or my colleagues have had situations, where a person with ID did come in for a forensic collection.
Mm-hmm.
And really thoroughly, we have to assess, like you said, as well as explain consent,
Mm-hmm.
which we do with every client, but just making sure that assessment part is key in there because we want to be sure that both parties were consenting, not consenting, or whatever, however it goes. We want to make sure that we get it right. So my question
Mm-hmm.
to you is for anybody that might not be in this role as we are, say a family member or friend, and they learn about their friend with ID not having consensual sexual relationship or even being in a relationship, how would you go about handling that?
Absolutely. So, if anyone suspects that a person with ID is the victim of a sexual or physical crime, similarly to elder abuse or child abuse, that suspected abuse would need to be reported to Adult Protective Services first and foremost. And then I would say, for adults and professionals providing care to an adult with ID, in the instance of a forensic collection, I would say the most important thing to first do would be to establish if this adult is their own guardian or if this adult has a medical POA or a an outside guardian, which would typically be a family member, but could also be a conservator or another related or known person. Um, if that adult does not have a guardian and they are their own guardian, it would just be very essential to take your time and make sure that the adult fully understands what you are sharing. As a former victim advocate, I can speak and say, our materials are written in a way that make total sense to us as adults with neurotypical brains who read and understand at a high level. But we have some medical terminology in that paperwork that typically functioning adults might have trouble understanding, and adults with ID might have trouble understanding, especially if they haven't been exposed to that much information about sex and consent and abuse and neglect and all of those things. So I would say, an important thing to do would be to read the material and assess for understanding, maybe ask some questions back to the adult with ID to just kind of make sure that they're following along and present all of the options. It might be easy to assume what the adult with ID would like to do with their collection or with reporting, or to try to make the decision that you feel is best for that individual. But I think it's really important that they get as many options and the same options that any other adult would get. Now, if that adult did have a guardian, of course, that person would have to be contacted. But I still think it's really vital that the victim in this situation is also included in the decisions that are made with the reporting and the collection.
Yeah, I kind of want to focus a little bit on the advocacy part of reporting with people with IDs, because I feel like sometimes people with IDs are not believed, um,
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
maybe people might think that, hey, maybe something did happen, but it feels a little exaggerated. Um, so, can you tell me a little bit about maybe your thoughts on how we can best advocate or anything really in regards to that with reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're correct. Unfortunately, we know that certain marginalized populations have a higher tendency to struggle within the legal system, within the reporting structure, and adults with intellectual disability, it is really common for them to not be believed or not be fully believed in what they are saying. So it is super important that as a victim advocate or even as a supportive family member, friend, or just someone who's called to, assist adults with ID, that we don't speak for, but we definitely help that person amplify their voice. One of the things we could do for an adult with ID would be, I guess, similar to any other victim, is sit down and help that person write out things like victim impact statements or law enforcement statements, and just kind of help them focus and rephrase their words in a way that is strong. We can provide emotional support to that person because for anybody, being interviewed by law enforcement or talking about sexual or physical abuse can be super overstimulating and overwhelming. We can just be that emotional support person. And we might have to go the extra mile, and we might have to take some extra steps, such as, have a physician evaluate that person and give that kind of backup that that person is, able to give that kind of truthful statement.
Yeah, that's great. I think that it is really important to be there for the emotional side, just because I mean we're there for everybody emotionally when things like that happen. But I also like what you said, kind of sitting down with them and helping them write out the statement, maybe clarify some of their statements as well, so that
Mm-hmm.
law enforcement can understand it. And yeah, I think that's
Yeah, definitely. I mean, someone with an ID, might say things in a different way than we say them or understand them, but it does not mean that what they're sharing is not truthful. And I also think another helpful thing an advocate could do would also be to help a person with a disability learn how to articulate their disability and the ways that it affects them and does not affect them. So that way they, someone with ID could be empowered to tell a law enforcement officer, yes, I have autism. It affects me in these ways, but I am able to determine whether or not I gave consent. I am able to identify when I have been abused, or I am able to give this statement today and, tell the true story of what happened.
I like that. That's I know that this is your specialty now that you have left VSC, but I think that that's really great. And yeah, I've honestly learned a few things. So awesome. Thank you. Okay. Well, what tips do you have for interacting and working with adults with ID?
Yes, absolutely. So, this first tip I'm going to share is going to be kind of funny because here I am, a neurotypical person, speaking about the ID community. But my number one tip is to ask and to not assume and to not speak for someone with a disability. So, just kind of in that light, I did interview 3 individuals that live in the community that I work at and ask them what their tips would be. Because I do want to highlight how important it is to not speak on behalf. So, I'm going to identify the male resident that I interviewed as Mr. John Doe. And the 2 females that I did interview for this podcast both wanted to be referred to as Jane Doe. So they are a collective Jane Doe.
Love that.
Yeah. So what John and Jane both shared is that they commonly feel like when they tell people that they have a disability, they feel like people don't want to deal with them. And I asked in what setting, and all 3 of them shared, this relates to employers and to people that they are interested in being friends with. So I would say, based on that, a tip is to not make someone feel othered or unaccepted when they share with you about their disability. Another thing that my Jane Does brought up is that the social stigma is really hard. Harmful language that still is used today, such as the R word, is really, really hurtful for adults with ID and is absolutely not appropriate or scientifically purposed anymore. And my Mr. John Doe, he shared that there is a difficulty that service providers might have balancing integration and safety. So the way that he described this is that people with intellectual disability do best when they are integrated in society with neurotypical people, but he does acknowledge that that is not always safe for all people with ID. So my tip would be to remember that there is no one size fits all service that's going to work for all adults with ID. But the goal should be to integrate adults with ID in the community as much as possible in a way that is safe for them.
That's awesome. I know that, I mean, we've talked offline about your job, and I know that you will take them, I think, to, Walmart, or I don't remember exactly. I feel like you might have said a park or something like that, which is always super chill and relaxing. Um, so I think that that's also great. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what you do at your job?
100%. So, as a case manager, my number one goal is to help people that move into my community thrive in that community, whether that's through mediating social issues, through skill building and acquiring skills that allow that person to become more independent. I write service plans. I write behavior support plans. And one of the fun things that you kind of mentioned that I do as part of my job is help people become more integrated in the community by facilitating community outings. So, just based on the individual, I like to find the least restrictive method to get that person out in the community. So, if I have a client or resident who has pretty good safety awareness and has adaptive skills on the higher level, I might just be the driver for a community outing. I will find out what that individual wants to do in the community. I will identify any potential safety concerns ahead of time and kind of talk about them with the person. And I might be around, but I might just be a driver. And for some of our guys and gals who struggle a little bit more with mobility or safety awareness, I might stay with them. But I might do something like let the person, pay for their meal or pay for the item they're buying independently with a card, or allow them to just kind of direct me around the community. And I definitely encourage, positive social interaction with people that do not live in our tiny community.
That's awesome. I would love to just hang out and be a driver. It'd be so fun. Fun
It
outing.
is fun.
Uh,
Yes.
okay, well, that's really awesome. And I think you do fantastic work. Uh,
Thank you.
us at VSC are super proud of you and your journey onwards. Um, do you have any resources for adults with ID and their caregivers?
Absolutely. So I think it kind of depends what the goal is, but if you are a person with ID who has just recently learned of your diagnosis, or if you are a caregiver, family member, friend of someone with ID of any age, I would implore you to check out the Department of Health website, where you can find resources for diagnosing, assistance applying for different types of insurance or waiver programs, stay programs, etc. If you are looking for a really awesome way for an adult or a child with ID to get integrated into a supportive community, I would check out Special Olympics. They do really great work for children that like to play sports and want to feel like a part of a team or a part of a competition. And then for adults looking to enter or get back into the workforce, I would definitely recommend looking into a local vocational rehab program, so that someone who is an expert on getting employed and staying employed can help you identify what skills you can work on and what best fits in the community there are for you to work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. We appreciate having you.
Thank you so much.
The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. The views and opinions expressed by podcast participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. This podcast content is made available for informational and educational purposes, and the VSC does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the content. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear, and you are not alone.